Hello everybody, welcome back to Screen Stars. I'm here today to bring you my review for the 2020 documentary show on Netflix, The Ripper. Now, The Ripper, where do you start with this one? Now, I'm sure many of you, definitely in the UK, but probably around the world as well, have heard of the Yorkshire Ripper. Now, this was a serial killer that operated in the north of England in the 1970s and early 80s, primarily in Yorkshire, around Leeds and West Yorkshire, and essentially had the country in a state of fear, certainly the north of England in a state of fear, for much of the 70s. Now, I was born in 1972. So I have got some memories of this, and my main memories of this is fear. Seeing these news stories, not really understanding what was going on the local news and national news, and just having this sense of fear all the time, and my mother being afraid, even though not verbalizing it. And it was just an uneasy time, to say the least. And I was really interested in checking out this documentary on Netflix. I think Netflix, personally, generally speaking, do really quite nice documentaries. I watched the Madeleine McCann one last year. I've watched a few of them now, and some of them I think I'll get around to reviewing that, and some of them I don't. But I felt strongly enough to do a review on this one because it was a documentary that hit close to home, if you like. And the reason why I say that as well is one of the victims of the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe, was killed in Halifax, which is where I live, and the place where he committed his murder is a place that I drive past very, very regular. So that's how close to home it is, these deaths. I mean, Leeds, where he killed many of his victims, is what, 15-mile drive from where I live, you know, so it feels still very close to home to many of us, certainly in Yorkshire and in the areas where I live. Now this story has been put to screen many times in documentaries similar to this, and even dramatisations over the years, and they all are usually quite interesting. I've watched many of them over the years, and there was a recent, I think it was BBC, did a documentary series on the Ripper, which I watched with my wife, and enjoyed that one as well. And that was done slightly differently to this one, but this one focused heavily on it. It was 4 episodes, and it focused heavily on, obviously, the killings in the 70s and the early 80s, and how it came to be that he was caught, and the failings of the police, because it is very. Now, I'm not here to judge, not in that way. I'm not here to be judge, jury, and executioner. Obviously, Peter Sutcliffe, I mean, he died last year anyway, and we all hope he's burning in the pits of hell. But I'm not here to pass judgment on any of the people involved in trying to catch him. I'm sure they were doing what they thought was best to try and catch this vicious killer. But this documentary was really good, I think, in highlighting the failings here. And for those of you that don't know the case, I mean, there was some really good police work going on here. I mean, really, you know, in the 70s, you've got to remember, they didn't have DNA and all this kind of stuff. It was a different time for investigations and things like that, and it was all done by, you know, phone calls and face-to-face interviews and paperwork piling up and this kind of stuff. And they did talk about the complexities of the case, and, you know, how difficult it was to keep track and all this kind of stuff. But they did find some good evidence. They found tyre tracks. They found a fresh, crisp £5 note, which was the going rate for prostitutes at the time, and many of his victims were prostitutes, that would eventually, and it showed in the documentary, this £5 note especially would have led eventually to Peter Sutcliffe's place of work, and would have identified him. And if they'd have followed that line of inquiry to its fullest, they would have probably saved lives and caught Peter Sutcliffe sooner than they did, which is a real shame. And it also comes to light in the documentary that he was interviewed, Peter Sutcliffe, was it 9 times, something like that. Officers, certainly one of them that were interviewed, because many people that appear in this documentary were police officers involved in the case, journalists associated with the case, members of families of victims and things associated to the Yorkshire Ripper. So all these people were like, first-hand knowledge of the case. And some of the officers, one of them in particular, said that he raised to his superiors that he had worries about Peter Sutcliffe when he interviewed him. Things just didn't add up. But by that point, and again, you may not know this, there was, excuse me, some letters and a tape sent to the police by a guy with a Geordie accent who claimed to be the Ripper, and the police were so convinced that this was the guy, all of the lines of inquiry were kind of dropped, I suppose, to a large degree, and they followed this tape line of inquiry, and it was a hoax. It led them down the wrong path, and it derailed the investigation massively, which was a real shame, and I think again showed the failings of the police force, just focusing just on this. And they spent millions, trying to getting people in the public to hear this voice, to try and identify him. They connected with the Sunderland Police Department to try and figure out who he is, where he lived, all this kind of. They spent literally years and so much money following this line of inquiry, and it was the wrong line of inquiry. And if again, if you know the case, and they do highlight it here, how Peter Sutcliffe was caught was just a stroke of luck. It was just 2 bobbies seeing a guy and a woman in a car and checking on it, and then it turned out it was Peter Sutcliffe, and they went back to search the site and found his murder weapons, and that's how they caught Peter Sutcliffe. It was just through luck, really. But I've got to say, I really, really enjoyed this documentary. It was very, very hard-hitting. It was emotional at times and upsetting to watch some of the stuff, especially the family members talking and some of his victims who survived. But I do recommend it, especially if it's a subject matter that interests you, and especially if you like a good documentary. I think Netflix do a good job with this one, so I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. Very, very good, and definitely worth checking out. So thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you liked this review. Don't forget to check back on the channel for more content very, very soon.